Scott. Welcome to episode 24, Cell and Gene Therapies.
Yeah, great to be with you again, Mark. I can't believe we're up to 24 already, but I'm really looking forward to this topic. It's obviously of the moment and an important one in these times as well.
Yeah, it is, and I think for me personally, as you know, I was with the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation for 10 years.
Yeah,
we were fortunate to discover the gene for CF, and we thought that gene therapy would be something that would be relatively quick, and we invested in a lot of money in researchers back in the early 90s, and it's been a much longer process, but here we are, some 30 years later and starting to see a lot of these therapies now gene and cell therapies coming to market. So a very important discussion.
and they're certainly bringing some drug pricing and access questions with them, and I'm super pleased that we've got a couple of great experts in the space with us today.
Great. Let's get them on board and welcome to Eric Faulkner. He's the president of Passage Health Associates, and Alicia Silver has joined us. She's the director of market access for cell and gene therapy at AbbVie. We've been fortunate to have other AbbVie guests, so real experts in the field. But if we could, before we start, why don't we start with you? Just also talk about a little bit about your background, just a minute or two on your experience with the manufacturers and your career.
So about 30 years ago, started out as a cell and gene therapy scientist back in the days when gene therapies didn't work. Spent most of my career in large CROs, service providers, and industry. All across the arc of the companies I worked in, I was always involved with cell and gene. Been working in cell and gene for the past 25 years from more of an industry side perspective before there ever were gene therapies, when it was only a cell therapy industry, and have been fortunate enough to work on more than, 250 strategic scenarios in cell and gene across my career, everything from early product development through post-commercialization.
Excellent. Alicia, how about you?
Yeah, well, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm Alicia Silver. I head up our cell and gene therapy practice at AbbVie Health. In my role, I lead all of our engagements with clients on cell and gene therapy questions, both preclinical, clinical, commercial products, everything in between cell and gene. So that's the fun part of my job. My background, I was previously in industry for the last 12 or 15 years. And my roles have been all in market access, policy, reimbursement. But my beginning of my career was in bone marrow transplant. And so that really is kind of the foundation for where we've gone with covered policy reimbursement for cell and gene therapy. And it's been fun to kind of build on that experience over time.
Great. Well, welcome to you both. Mark, it's clear we've got two great experts again. And I'd like also just to extend our thanks to the Access Forum group. This is another episode that we're recording in collaboration with that team in terms of both topic selection as well as the recruitment of Eric and Alicia. So thank you to Joe Boswell and Komi Akposo for helping us with that. And let's get into our discussion. Oh, I should note, actually, I personally do have a relationship with AbbVie Health. I'm on the board there, but it hasn't had anything to do with, with our guest selection.
Well, certainly, because we got these two incredible experts. And so for us, we're thrilled that both of you have joined us. So today we're going to have a conversation and help our audience understand cell and gene therapy and the access challenges, the affordability challenges, and sort of not only where things are potentially been and where they are today, but and some thoughts on where they're gonna go. So with that, Scott, you want me to kick off the first question?
Yeah, sure. Why don't you take a swing? So
let's start with both of you have been involved in the industry for some period of time. So why don't you guys sort of help us understand some of the history, some of the steps that have taken to get to the marketplace where we are today related to cell and gene therapy, and of course, what leads to the pricing, and we'll dive into that a little bit deeper in just a minute. Eric, do you want to go first?
Sure. This has been kind of a long road, actually, like any sort of life sciences adventure. This has been going on for more than 30 years, almost 40 years. If you're looking at the cell therapy side, where the first products were chondrocyte therapies, more than anything else, the fully transformative therapies then came, like they did when in the era of precision medicine growth. A few drips and drabs at a time, and now we're getting to turning the spigot more fully on. But I think that the biggest things is a huge learning curve, because in this industry you can't take anything for granted. You've got to measure 3 times and cut once, because the pressures on these products, especially as we saw the more transformative outcome products and arguably transformative price products, they're born into reimbursement systems that never anticipated them. They have to overcome a lot of stakeholder hurdles. They have to even allow us to rethink what value means in a certain way, because it's all about magnitude and duration of effect, and we're talking possibly lifetime effect. And so we have to rethink multiple elements, but to get these products ready for market, it requires integration and a lot of planning, more so than any other asset that I've worked on. Alicia.
Yeah, more than a decade ago, when I was in bone marrow transplantation at Be the Match, which is the national registry for bone marrow transplantation donors, the executive leadership team kind of had this aha moment where they were like, let's use our expertise in transplant and help the CAR T companies that are very nascent but coming along and close to approval, help them figure out what it's going to look like from an access perspective, manufacturing, all of those challenges. And so I had a front row seat to really helping the different manufacturers who were first to approval for the CAR T products figure out exactly what that landscape was going to look like. And it was an exciting time to be in transplant, to kind of see that transformation. Since then, we obviously, our payers, our providers, our patients to some extent understand CAR T, and that is what we would call the easier stuff. And now we're getting to a more difficult, challenging landscape from a reimbursement, payer coverage perspective, with more advanced gene therapies. Yesterday, there was a new approval for a neurologic-based gene therapy that's injected directly into the brain, which is just something that is completely going to change the dynamics of how payers think about coverage, reimbursement, all of those things. So definitely, we've come such a long ways from CAR T, which was what I view as kind of like the advent of cell and gene therapy as we see it today, to where we are now. And we even this last week had the approval of the first CAR T without a required REMS program, which it moves us further along in terms of safety and monitoring in CAR T.
And Alicia, could you expand just a little bit? What's a typical target patient population size for these kinds of medicines? And then how's that translate into the pricing model that Mark was asking about?
So that's a good question. We, in the CAR T space, we see a lot more comfort in the patient population in terms of hematologic malignancies larger. We're talking about things like leukemia, lymphoma, all different types of leukemia and lymphoma that have approvals today. In that space, we're talking about thousands of patients a year potentially across all of the market. But in the smaller gene therapy spaces, for example, we've had recent launches in sickle cell disease where we might get a couple hundred patients a year globally. And even smaller populations for things like monochromatic leukodystrophy, where we see, dozens of patients.
Yeah, it's hard. I think back to the days when I started in the industry, and it was all about the big primary care markets now, and it's just hard to imagine really that we've gotten to the point now where we're targeting populations that may have just a few hundreds of patients in them and that kind of thing. Now, let me turn to Eric next, and now I'm sure there's got to be a whole host of regulatory and reimbursement questions that come along that. What is the current, for the most part, let's say in general, regulatory and reimbursement framework for these things? Is it mandated that coverage mandated or not? How's reimbursement determined? Eric, why don't you tell us a little bit about those things first?
From a regulatory standpoint, we've seen evolution of pathways in the United States like RMAT, which are specifically focused on advanced therapies, but that doesn't mean that the advanced therapy goes through that process. It can go through a biological regulatory process. You've seen a lot of changes on the ATMP side in Europe from a reimbursement perspective and pricing perspective. I think that, again, a lot of these therapies were born into a world that never anticipated therapies at this price point and level of complexity. So it's been experience by experience. So the CAR Ts coming in, and I worked on the innovator CAR Ts, helping develop the evidence to support launch of them. They came into a market that wasn't ready for them, and arguably pharma was still learning what it meant to price and support reimbursement of an inpatient therapy, because the challenge with CAR T, with any inpatient therapy, is they didn't necessarily collect evidence on an episode of care or total cost of care basis. And what that meant when the DRG was priced, that it underpaid the physicians because it did cover the cost of the product itself. And so each of the products we've seen come to market, I spent a lot of time working as a Novartis employee and part of the executive access team, helping to scale Zolgensma, which was a different kind of animal. So even in rare, it was still a fairly common rare disease, and I would guess somewhere between 25 and 103,000 worldwide patients have now been treated. That product had an easier access journey on some level, but we did launch it across 55 plus markets. If you would have asked me even a few years before if that would have been possible, I would have said no. But it is possible. And then we've seen a lot of things like sickle cell, the beta thalassemia products. We've seen hemophilia products. Each one has their own unique sets of challenges, because you're kind of taking your machete and chopping through the jungle to address reimbursement. And as the price points have continued to go up, you can't just think about the payer as a stakeholder. You have to think about provider, the whole ecosystem, because in the US, for a buy and bill scenario, there's no hospital system in the US or maybe anywhere else that could handle something where they're taking on even part of the risk of $3.5 to $4.5 million product. So it's still lots of lessons. Every product that launches is a learning experience. You have hemophilia products where there is competition from what has come before, which, the payers may have said, is that good enough therapy? There are lots of challenges and lots of lessons, but you can learn from the examples of the past, but you still have to be prepared for the unique scenarios with each of these launches that are coming through.
Yeah. Alicia, could you expand on that just a little bit, Mark? But specifically, typically is coverage required? And then also, how's reimbursement actually get set? Mark or Eric mentioned, the prices are high and it's a buy and bill environment. So how does that work?
Yeah, so for the smaller gene therapies that have been approved recently, smaller patient population gene therapies, we're seeing more case-by-case basis determination of coverage. And so even the manufacturers that are out there working really hard, putting the patient first, pounding the ground before launch, are still seeing trouble launching in various types of payer situations. And I would probably call out state Medicaid programs as the number one culprit of issues from a patient access perspective. In terms of reimbursement and how that's set, Medicare is still king in terms of thinking about how we set DRG rates that flow down into other payers. There are definitely different methodologies that payers are taking from a reimbursement perspective. Single case agreements are to date the most common from a commercial payer perspective. That's payers like Blue Cross Blue Shield, for example. And they have gotten pretty good at doing single case agreements for CAR T products. We hear from administrators at transplant centers that do the CAR T administrations that they are not having as much trouble as they did in the past with single case agreement negotiation, especially with larger payers. But difficulty ranges from difficulty administering the single case agreement negotiation, but also just getting enough adequate reimbursement that access is a reality for the patient. And then in terms of actual, case rates that'll exist, that's coming. We're going to start seeing case rates for CAR T, which again has been around for about 6-7 years. So at that point, we're starting to see enough volume that payers are going to feel comfortable, large national payers will feel comfortable putting together a case rate for those cases.
Thank you.
Can I just, I don't mean to go back to, but I do want to go back just one bit, because we talk about cell and gene like sort of it's one bucket. I just, for our listeners, I just want to make sure we spend just a minute separating each one, because and including, and Alicia, if you could, like even, or Eric as well, just how they're administered, because I know a cell therapy could involve months of being in a hospital and a whole host of other challenges. And I know some gene therapies that are whatever, a 4-hour infusion and you walk out the door, right? So could you help us understand sort of the products, and again, in categories, the product categories, and because I think that impacts also the price and the coverage implication.
Yeah, I'll give a couple examples and maybe Eric can fill in some of the others. CAR T predominantly is done in an inpatient setting today. It's definitely moving outpatient. But what happens is a patient has an apheresis procedure done. The apheresis product is shipped to a manufacturer where new manufacturing takes place. But then it gets shipped back to the hospital. And then the patient typically undergoes a myeloablative conditioning, or like a total depletion of their immune system so that they're ready to take in the cells. And then essentially the product is infused, administered in the inpatient setting typically, and the patient is monitored for a period of time after. The amount of time monitoring after is really dependent on the patient particular profile, but something like 10 to 30 days, not all inpatient, but some combination of inpatient and outpatient visits. On the flip side, we have products like the hemophilia gene therapies that are administered one day in and out outpatient. And those are much more simple administrations there's no conditioning, there's no myeloablative conditioning, so there's no toxicity to the patient that happens, but there definitely still is a monitoring period afterwards in the infusion, but also follow-up visits that occur after the initial administration.
Eric, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, and sometimes it just depends, right? So you would have had cell therapies that were in trials for critical limb ischemia that would have involved 40 to 50 injections from your knee down to administer the cells and enough geographic coverage to have them do their thing. You had some of the cardiac therapies, worked on 7 or 8 of them that were in development that would have involved femoral catheterization and injection directly into your still beating heart, as well as some very complex early ocular therapies that required almost like the Death Star, get the Millennium Falcon to the center of the Death Star to do the injection. So it just depends. I mean, we're getting simpler and simpler, but it depends on where the cells or gene therapy has to get to. If it has to cross the blood-brain barrier, if it has to go somewhere more complicated, then the Parkinson's ones that involve injection into your head. It just depends on where they have to go and how you get there.
But I also, just so I could,
Yeah.
some of these are miracles, right? Like,
Oh, sure.
restoring, curing blindness and treating uncurable cancers. And I mean, there's just some truly remarkable patient success stories from these products. Would you agree, Alicia?
Certainly. And you see cases we hear often about Emily Whitehead, one of the first CAR T patients in the country, and just the change to her life, her family's life, and just the trajectory of medicine overall following that administration. So I would totally agree. From a patient perspective, from a family caregiver perspective, these therapies are game changers and miracles.
And a shout out to the pharmaceutical industry for investing in cures, investing in treatments that is truly saving lives.
And that's why we do this. I think that's why, I'm sure Eric would agree, this is why we do what we do, because this isn't wet AMD in the eye. This is really foundational medicine to change people's lives.
And we're starting to see the bridge between more of the niche scenarios start to be bridged with things like we've had the first diabetes advanced therapies kind of get the green light from the FDA perspective. Some of the very early work in that field, you would have a substantial portion of the population that may be insulin independent for the rest of their life after a therapy. So, these therapies have more of a transformational effect. If it's not a cure, then I think anything that we have seen to date, and it's only going to get better and better, especially as we evolve to being able to hit multiple targets. Because right now our therapies are, a gene therapy at least, is more like a rifle, sometimes solving a shotgun disease problem. Sometimes it may have to hit more than one target to have an even more transformative effect than we've seen in the past, but we really haven't seen anything like these therapies in our lifetimes.
Well, that's fantastic. Let's turn back to the affordability and access questions and think about this a little bit through the patient lens. Can you tell us, what the impact is on patients as it relates to, the pricing and reimbursement, and, challenges associated with this, and maybe a little bit about payer utilization management as well? Why don't we start with Eric?
On the patient side, when patients do not have to have or don't have good reimbursement coverage for these things, it is a mighty mountain to climb for the expensive ones, because there are, there's crowdfunding solutions that have been applied. It's not like, if you had to do crowdfunding for a $4.5 million therapy, for example, that's a bigger mountain to climb than we have ever seen for most treatments. On the other side, the patient situation, it can get much worse and much better, because just this year we've seen one or two of the leading U.S. health plans carve out cell and gene therapies into buy-up plans. So if you happen to be in that buy-up for insurance protection, if you're unlucky enough to need one, kind of sales point from the plan, if you've got it, great. If you don't have it, then where are you, right? So there's some potential disparity of access for patients that may not even know they have access to those things. For the patient side, it could be daunting, but so far, I think it's been reasonable. I'll let Alicia see if she has a difference of opinion, but.
No, I totally agree. And we definitely, I think I called this out earlier in my remarks, but state Medicaid programs in the U.S. have been a big barrier for some cell and gene therapy products, and some states are better than others. And so I think that disparity note that Eric made about kind of what kind of payer you have, where you live, can really impact whether or not you get access to cell and gene therapy. And there is definitely a correlation between your payer type and, potential cure for your disease. One of the states that we've seen particular issues with is a state like Louisiana, that just does not want to fund CAR T. And that's very challenging, because there are good transplant centers that would happily perform CAR T procedures on patients, but it's been challenging to do that with state Medicaid patients.
Where do the patients typically turn for help then when they're trying to navigate this? Is it usually the doctor and the hospital system that is helping them? Or how about the manufacturer programs as well? What's the role for those things?
So manufacturer programs have gotten better and better. And coming from industry, I can tell you that the patient assistance programs are doing as much as they can within the bounds of current law. And they really want to be a partner to the patients and to their families and to the providers. The good manufacturers that are going to have commercial success are also partnering closely with providers and making sure that they understand the patient journey and how they can enable better access to payer reimbursement.
And what, if I could then, on this topic, what about like value-based pricing or outcomes agreements, or what's the mechanism that some of the coverage is happening?
To date, and in general, I know that things have been floated like the Netflix model and amortization and some of these more eccentric types of topics. But what that requires is, change at policy, legal, other levels within provider and payer organizations. Getting over that hill is very difficult. It takes years of push. What we've seen administered are more like value outcomes-based agreements that aren't terribly fancy, frankly, that may have some clawback or payback provision. It's usually short-term, between 6 and 18 months. But even for rare disease, many payers would never do risk-sharing agreements in rare disease because it doesn't have as much budget impact as, high ticket line items like obesity and heart disease and diabetes and Alzheimer's and other stuff. But they have in rare disease in cell and gene because of the cost point to manage.
Yeah, we've seen payers not be able to administer Netflix like agreements like they did in Hep C because it just doesn't have the patient base to do that type of model. But I would call out, and we can definitely talk more about this, the cell and gene therapy access model that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, CMMI, is launching in January, which is going to take a swing at outcomes-based agreements for sickle cell disease gene therapy, because that's going to be a game changer from a Medicaid access perspective, potentially, depending on the states that participate and if both manufacturers of those therapies participate.
And how if you could, dive into that a little bit deeper. How will that work?
Yeah, so we don't exactly know yet because the contracts haven't been released. But what we do know is there's going to be some pricing concessions from the manufacturers, mandatory pricing concessions on a couple of different fronts in terms of volume, if there's a certain number of volume of patients that are treated, outcomes, looking potentially at things like hospitalizations and vaso-occlusive crises, which are important factors in sickle cell disease management. So really getting into the clinical details of outcomes-based agreements and how we can think about showing value over time, and really marrying that with some price concessions, which is, I think, a challenging aspect for manufacturers, but definitely something that needs to be baked into pricing models, because we expect there could be more of these models in the future. But ultimately, there are also patient access arrangements that come with the model so that there are better guarantees from the state level that patients will have access to the therapies. And importantly, sickle cell disease is a patient-based population that has experienced enormous disparities over time, systematic disparities across the country. And really, we're excited to see a focus on sickle cell disease in particular because these patients deserve care and they definitely deserve a cure.
And sometimes, you hear about the role of reinsurance in these cases, and that that may take some of these concerns off the table, I'll say, for individual patient or individual plans or individual employer groups. But then other times you hear that, the employers are worried that they're going to, if they trigger it, they're going to lose their coverage or it's going to become more expensive. What's the role of reinsurance in all this?
I've worked on the reinsurance issue in this area for maybe 15 years, in maybe one of the first cases that it ever came up working with one manufacturer. And then also one of the things I do is lead an emerging tech institute with about 20,000 payers and providers in it. We've talked about reinsurance, did a whole series of papers for Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. Reinsurance is a Band-Aid at best here. It's not, but even the payers are worried about triggering if this goes from onesies or twosies to how it's paid for to losing reinsurance, not for the patient, but for the plan, right? Because the reinsurance was not built. It was built for the burn patients. And, when the train wreck happens, that's very infrequent, not as a seamless reimbursement model.
In this country, let's just, if I could, I think we've got a good handle. At least I'm getting a better handle on what's happening in this country. We'll just take a second because our last episode we focused on global drug pricing. What's happening just in the rest of not the whole world, but generally what's happening outside the U.S. in cell and gene therapy coverage?
Yeah, Europe has been particularly challenging for cell and gene therapy manufacturers in terms of their ability to just get basic coverage. Approval's not been the issue, but really getting reimbursement secured for patients across different countries has led some manufacturers to pull out of those markets entirely. And I think the best example to point to is Bluebird Bio, which pulled out entirely out of Europe because it just wasn't commercially sustainable to manufacture and provide therapy to patients in those countries.
Yeah, and from the Bluebird side, one of the pieces is if you're a small to mid-sized company, you might have to partner with a large pharma to get it pushed through. If you look at the flip side of Alicia's analogy with Spark and Luxturna, Novartis helped push, Luxturna out beyond the U.S. borders, and sometimes just having that muscle And just the on-the-ground experience can make a huge difference versus a biotech company that's going through a burn rate trying to get its products out there so that it can play catch up a little bit financially. And I do agree, Europe in particular has been kind of the elephant's graveyard for cell and gene therapy reimbursement. And part of it is because we're still coming up a learning curve. Some of the HTA organizations and payers still are measuring things through a more similar yardstick instead of looking at some of the differences. Even the value part, it's a huge mental flip to go from dose, cost, to you pay once, maybe a lot of money, but the payback period can be just a few years depending on what else may be available for treatment. If it's an enzyme replacement therapy, it pays itself back very quickly within a few years. If it's something else, then we have to look at other aspects. But I think that Europe has had a harder time grappling and coming, together, even with groups like NICE being kind of at the vanguard to say, hey, we're about to get deluged with cell and gene therapies. We better think through the process. But we've seen challenges. We've seen the GBA, for example, with SMA products, go from we don't like to look at real world evidence to we are going to require the most sentinel RWE study in history to compare Spinraza and Zolgensma. So there's a lot of changes, but so far we haven't seen it any sort of home run gains in Europe for getting these therapies to patients.
If I could, though, and going back to, it sounds like it's both in globally as well in the U.S., but the short-term mentality versus the long-term benefit, right? And because hemophilia is a great example. What does it cost to treat a hemophilia patient every year? It's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And that there's a gene therapy that has a large one-time cost, but the durability of that gene therapy could be years and years and years, right? So it could be cost effective over a long period of time. How do we overcome this sort of short-term sticker shock versus starting to look at it over the long-term value that it is in terms of a cost-effective option?
I think that's particularly challenging in the U.S. where we have some portability of our health plans. You can go from one job to another and your health plan changes, many years at a time. And I think that concept is not particularly conducive to payers being able to think about long-term cost savings, because if you, for example, pay for Zolgensma for a patient, if that patient changes plans 5 years later, you're not going to see the cost savings from the treatment effect. And I think that is the impediment that we have in the U.S. Single health systems should, in theory, be more recognizing of long-term cost benefit from gene therapy and cell therapy, but I think that is still a challenge.
If we had pricing like early biologics in the, $20,000, $40,000 range, we wouldn't even be having this conversation today, right? But I think that, Alicia's exactly right. It just depends on, the payer system circumstances. With the U.S. commercial payers, for example, they're churning through a beneficiary within a couple of years, give or take, 6 months. And so they have a very different view. If it was $20,000, they think, well, what goes around comes around. But when you're talking about investing $4.5 million, then the math from an actuarial standpoint begins to look kind of different.
And one last question, Scott, before
please.
I'm sure it's not going to be my last question, so let me take that back. But on that note, I just want to, with all the challenges related to access and affordability, help us understand how providers are looking at this, right? Like, what's their perspective on wanting to, utilize these incredible breakthrough therapies,
including, just the complexity of the delivery system mechanisms that you guys described. Must be that not every provider is getting into this. Is that right?
Yeah, most of our provider experience today in the U.S. happens in academic medical centers. And so there's then this transformation of traditional cell and gene therapy, not the gene therapy that we've talked about for Parkinson's disease that'll happen with neurosurgeons in an operating room, but traditional cell and gene therapy that is more transplant based happens in transplant centers that have been administering these types of therapies going back to bone marrow transplant for 40 plus years. And so the providers, from my experience working with them for years, have been like incredibly passionate about patient access to novel therapies. And they really, I think each center kind of competes with the other, trying to see where they can onboard more quickly. How many CAR T programs do you have established at your center? Like really trying to be forward thinking in terms of patient access across the country. They also are great advocates in terms of thinking about fixes that are really technical on Medicare reimbursement, payment policy, going to the agency and partnering with manufacturers to help solve some very, very tricky situations from a reimbursement perspective that can impede patient access at all different payer levels.
Because a lot we have seen has been more in that center of excellence type model for a number of reasons. If something goes wrong, there's a safety issue with the patient, they want to make sure they can just roll them across the hall and address, versus a more community hospital based mechanism, for some of these things. And from a payer standpoint, it consolidates the access where they feel more secure about some of the safety issues as well. The providers are excited about the stuff, but I think that, there's a lot of supply chain handling, cryo, issues, other stuff with how these things are handled. And so the provider has to have that infrastructure in place, especially as this area begins to ramp and more therapies come, because you just don't have a, tandem dump truckload of these things sitting around because of the handling conditions. And specialty pharma has been one mechanism, although if specialty pharma is helping you get the supply chain issues handled, you still have to deal with cost of administration and training. The training hurdle at the provider level for these therapies, just because of the complexity, is also more, as you would expect.
And then beds too, I think is the number one impediment that we haven't talked about, which is going to be the physical constraints at each center. And that's why we see this push in the CAR T setting for sure. And in the gene therapies that are approved for outpatient utilization, we're going to see more and more cell and gene therapies outpatient to free up some capacity in beds for additional access for patients. That comes with its own set of challenges, certainly. And from a payer perspective, that's not a home run by any stretch. But from a provider perspective, it has to be the way of the future so we can enable all of the therapies that are in the pipeline to be administered to patients.
And we're seeing a couple of interesting moves, largely on the CAR T side now. But if you look at the manufacturing side of this industry, there are easily over a dozen decentralized manufacturing devices from the size of a desktop to a Volkswagen minibus that are on their way. And we've seen some examples of decentralized CAR T manufacturing and administration. And that sort of thing, if it were to become commonplace, would also have a very heavy change impact on this whole industry, because it may make the providers want to seek out being profit centers if they're able to manufacture technically the therapy in a decentralized way, like homebrewing it in your garage almost, with more controls than that. It may change the whole business model for parts of this space over time.
Right. And if I could, and don't worry about the background noise, because Caleb, our wonderful engineer, will work that out. I do want to turn to the patient side of things and the patient assistance programs, because I don't think manufacturers get enough recognition. They get criticized for the high price, but they never get criticized. They never get the benefit, the pat on the back for providing these safety net programs. How important have these sort of patient assistance and safety net programs been to the industry, or for cell and gene therapy patients?
I think they've been foundational in terms of helping providers feel comfortable referring their patients for cell and gene therapy. There are necessary funds for travel and lodging because these therapies aren't available at every city, every major metropolitan area across the country. At launch, sometimes there are only a few centers that are approved to provide the therapies. So from that perspective, there needs to be travel and lodging funds. And so some companies have worked with OIG to get opinions to be able to provide travel and lodging benefits to patients. But we've also seen manufacturers go above and beyond in terms of what they're thinking. We're working with a manufacturer who is providing pet insurance assistance. So that because pets are a big deal. If you're away for 30 days, who's going to take care of your cat or dog? So we've definitely seen manufacturers step up and try and provide the most they can within the bounds of law.
That's great. Eric, anything?
There has been more of a push for the patient assistance to solve some of these complex scenarios, like having to be away from home, for long periods of time, et cetera, even to really pushing to change policies around diagnostic testing and other stuff. I know that with the Zolgensma experience, the team kind of moved heaven and earth and managed to achieve reimbursement for the testing, make sure the test was offered for SMA patients as early as possible, and they covered most of the United States, which I had never seen any group kind of do that. So it just shows how these manufacturer teams are willing to go the extra mile, because in some cases it makes the difference between what kind of life a patient has or if they'll even be alive. There's a different investment, in your heart for cell and gene therapy, because you do know it's not just making your cold. It's not like making your cold a little bit better. It's, are these patients going to live or die, or what kind of life can they have?
And I would just be remiss if we didn't mention the fertility preservation services for myeloablative therapies like sickle cell gene therapy, because it's really a barrier. If a patient doesn't have the opportunity to preserve fertility for future years, they're probably going to think about their choices, and maybe that isn't gene therapy. And so we're impeding a cure from that perspective if we're not providing or allowing manufacturers to provide fertility preservation services.
In addition to these kinds of services, how prominent or not are the free goods programs for patients that actually end up with a denial, or are there not that many ultimate denials?
I think it just depends on the market and the scenario. I think if you look in general at some market areas like South America, it's more challenging just because it's more of a cost-based market environment in toto. And so how the controls that are there in terms of patient access can be highly variable versus, US, Europe, et cetera. So I think there is some of that, but it's a lot more challenging than in small molecule, oral scenarios where you can take deep discounts, et cetera. With the cost of goods for these therapies, it's a lot harder to go as far as you can down that line, if that makes sense.
And if we look ahead and think about from the, again, coverage and reimbursement perspective, what may evolve here, are there any anticipated new policies or legislative changes or anything in the markets happening in those spaces that we should be aware of?
So we're 1 week out from the election. We're all preparing for the Trump administration transition. Eric is laughing at me because it's been a week. It's been a real week trying to just dive into exactly what the Republican sweep of the House, Senate, and White House is going to mean for health policy. But we spent a lot of time thinking about what it's going to mean for cell and gene therapy patients. And there is just a couple of things that I would like to point out, things that could be coming in the next year that would be relevant. And the first of which is Medicaid work requirements. And so we saw this with the first Trump administration, and we're, I think, fortunate to have a reference point looking back at the first administration to kind of give us clues about what could come in the second administration in terms of their thinking around health policy. Medicaid work requirements would definitely put barriers up for patients to have access to Medicaid and subsequently cell and gene therapy products and all types of medicine. But definitely in this case, when we're thinking about life-saving, life-changing therapies, it's enormous from payer access perspective. The second is Medicare Advantage, we've definitely seen an enormous shift over the past decade towards greater enrollment in Medicare Advantage plans. What does that mean for cell and gene therapy? The biggest risk from a cell and gene therapy perspective is more narrow networks, prior authorization, delayed timelines to therapy administration. So when we're thinking about like practical impacts beyond just who's going to be FDA commissioner, who's going to be HHS secretary, our team is really digging into kind of the details of where patient access could go wrong in between the lines.
The biggest area that needs improvement, I think, in the U.S. is the Medicaid side, because, Alicia talked about oncology side, but on the rare disease side, by the time a lot of these families get there, they may be on Medicaid. Just dealing with, patients that have very costly, complex problems, and Medicaid in general, state by state, almost has an allergic reaction to anything that's expensive. And here we're talking about, something that's a standard deviation or two more expensive. And so how we work through that problem and challenge state by state or, on a country level for solutions will be important. And then I think these insurance plan products that we see will be a game changer. You're either in or you're out. And we'll see how those change the landscape a bit, at least in markets like the U.S. for reimbursement.
Could you talk a little bit more about those insurance plans that you're referring to?
So one example, Cigna. So Cigna has, you can go to Cigna's website, look at it, and it's basically for those of you that might be unfortunate enough to need an advanced therapy. Then we have a product for you. So it's like flood insurance or lightning strike insurance or something like that, where you pay. But how do we keep patients from slipping through the cracks, or how do we keep patients from having a financial train wreck that aren't there? So what that plan product is basically a kick the can at the patient level in terms of responsibility in the absence of our system figuring out something else. People had proposed funds for many years, like, have the cancer drug fund in the UK. None of that's materialized because no stakeholders pushed it to make it happen. You have things like high risk pools and funds that have been attempted in Canada. Sometimes there are issues with how those are administered, but there has been no collective solution that's been pushed. And so maybe the health plans have felt like, we have a solution. If you don't, pay into this other fund, then you don't get access to any cell or gene therapy, which might not be an ideal solution, but it's only in the absence of something else that either the federal government could drive, or there could be another, push on behalf of, industries.
That makes sense. And again, for full disclosure, at CareMedics, we started a company called Outcome RX, and we've sold it to about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and it does have a product focused on, like you said, sort of these add-on, cell and gene therapy coverages on the top of your traditional insurance. So. Scott and I have always been good about making sure we're disclosing any conflicts here.
I'm not saying it's good or bad. It's just a product that has evolved to address the absence of another solution, right?
Well, that takes us to our final question, which is, if you had a magic wand and you could do anything to help make access and affordability better for patients. So let's start with you, Alicia. What would your prescription for better access be for cell and gene therapy?
When we've seen things go right, it's with manufacturers and systems that are thinking about the patient first, because all of this innovation is really worthless without patient access. And I am a mom of 3 and healthy kids, super fortunate to have healthy kids. But I definitely am motivated and am up at night thinking about the challenges of patients with parents who are thinking about their children, what their conditions could mean for their life and how they can get access to therapies. So I think it's really important as we're moving through, rote decisions with payer coverage policies, and how does this manufacturing step impact the full line of supply chain, to just think about patients, and the bottom of every decision should be what impact does this have on patients?
Excellent. Eric?
There's a concept called the cycle of unaccountability in healthcare, where you just kick everything down to the next stakeholder in line. If I could wave a magic wand, look, cell and gene therapies have the potential to change our viewpoint of what good looks like. If you have a cell or gene therapy that is successful in a particular disease area, it automatically will set the bar higher for any other product that ever comes in. So it changes what good looks like, but it also is changing our perspective for value in the long term and how healthcare is even administered and the operational issues of healthcare. If I could wave my magic wand, it would take away the cycle of unaccountability, and people would understand that there are 2,800 to 3,000 cell and gene therapies in clinical trials, and we're just barely seeing the first few come out. It was a watershed year last couple of years, right? That people would sit down and say, what is this going to mean? How do we rethink things? And everybody put together a solution that's patient focused. Because if we don't, we'll still end up with, hey, how do we pay for these? And now it would be amplified because we're going to have 20, 40, 60 more in not such a long period of time. If we don't take the effort to think through it now, then we'll have more problems by just waiting to play catch up. And there aren't a lot of incentives. If you look at commercial payers, not to ding them in any way, but there is no incentive for them to innovate until they're drowning in these therapies, right? So I think the federal government should hopefully take a little bit of the lead, and we have some examples from groups like Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium and groups like ARPA-H trying to look at this stuff, but not the important reimbursement, rubber meets the road patient access challenges. It's more like, how do we develop more of these things instead of how do we deal with the ones that are already coming? And so that would be my magic wand wish.
Scott?
Those are good ones, both of them.
They are.
All right, what a fascinating conversation, Mark. I really have enjoyed learning about this. There's so many layers to it. Why don't you share with us first some of the key lessons that you took away here?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you to both of our guests, right, for joining us. Extraordinary, truly experts on this space, and I think that the sort of from my perspective, I've been whatever you want to call it, an advocate for the pharmaceutical industry. Again, my time at the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, investing in drug development and research back 40 years ago, is my roots. So anytime we can make a drug happen, make a cell, gene therapy, whatever it might be, to treat a patient, create a cure, those are miracles. And those are miracles that we should celebrate. And I know they come with high costs. I know they come with challenges, but we should have the way to be able to manage through those, right? Because again, the long-term impact of somebody being healthy versus being sick for long periods of time, it is cost effective. And I love Eric, and I'm going to probably steal it, Eric. So the cycle of unaccountability, we always call it, you've heard on this podcast, the kicking the can down the road. It's time for somebody to pick up the can, right? And move on. So, and I also think that there are, it's something that I've been, working on and talking about for many years, is this concept of the federal government having, Eric mentioned it. I'd already written down, Eric, I won't show you, but I'd already written down the flood insurance before you said flood insurance. But it truly is this sort of like this last resort bucket that the federal government should have a larger role. We had back in the day, catastrophic health coverage. There's still, as you know, Alicia, a lot of state policies that have catastrophic coverage for children, things like that. So those things I continue to believe are something that we should consider. But again, 2,800 to 3,000 drugs in development, it's coming. We're going to look back at 2024 and realize we're still in maybe the top of the first inning. It's football season. So what are we in? We're in the first 4 minutes of the game. Yeah, we're still early in the first quarter. So it's gonna be a pretty dramatic next few years. How about you, Scott?
I've been struck how this is not just an evolution of the market, but it's a step change, really, both on the scientific and curative potential side or impact, on disease side, as well as on the pricing, reimbursement, coverage kinds of questions as well. And there's a whole host of unknowns associated with that step change and a lot of complexity, as we've discussed here. And we're going through, I hadn't really thought about it this way before, but it's not only a scientific journey here about the evolution of the therapies themselves and the insights that drive that and permit it and all that, but there's actually a journey on the reimbursement and coverage side as well.
Right.
That's being figured out kind of, or not, perhaps, as you guys were alluding to, kind of right in front of our eyes. And, what an interesting way to think about that and understand that this is going to continue to evolve probably for some time, I would guess. Beneath that sort of macro perspective, I was intrigued by the necessity of and the challenge of the value assessment frameworks adapting to this and how important that's going to be. It's obviously foundational outside the U.S., and I think it's likely to become more and more important here in the U.S., particularly with these kinds of horizons and the need for some really good leadership, I'll say, in allowing that, permitting that. And then lastly, another, but I would distressed to hear of the coverage challenges, even outside the U.S., even in other developed nations. And it exacerbates this notion, as you know, that the U.S. is paying the way for others, and others are benefiting from the work here. And we know that creates a tension. It creates a tension in the pricing model, and it shows up in the system in the U.S., and it creates a tension, politically as well, and becomes a challenge. And I think that's, the U.S. and the industry are going to have to. It strikes me if the science all comes true here, something's going to have to happen to address this difference in the market. So anyway, I'm sure there are a million things we could go on to. What a fascinating discussion, and it'll be super interesting to revisit this one, a couple years down the road and see what's happening.
Well, absolutely. Well, with that, thank you. Let's wrap up episode 24. Thank you to our guests, Eric Faulkner, Alicia Silver. We will have show notes about this episode. We'll have ways for our listeners to reach Eric and Alicia. Also, thanks to my partner Scott Howe, and for this episode, thank you to the Access Forum and the team of market access professionals. This is our second of three episodes. Next one will come early in 2025. And so with that, anything else, Scott?
No, just add my thanks to Eric and Alicia. What a pleasure to hear from them today. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Great to hear from everybody. Great to hear from you too, Alicia. Your perspective, slugging it out in the trenches.
Same to you, Eric.
All right. Thank you, everybody.